this section, we're going to continue to look at the Outlook 2010 workspace in more detail. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time to begin with looking at views. When people use Outlook, they often don't think in terms of the views that they can see, but in fact the views are very important. And although they're different depending on the module that we're using, such as the calendar or email, they do share quite a lot of features in common, and learning about those features can help us to use Outlook more productively. When I'm in Mail view, for instance, I have, as we've seen, the to-do bar on the right, the navigation bar on the left, and in the middle the content of the information viewer, which when I'm looking at mail depends on what I've got selected on the left. So for instance, I have now selected an inbox with no messages in it, so it looks pretty empty. But if I select an inbox which has got messages in it, then whichever message I select is on the left hand half of the information viewer. I can see the message itself in the right hand half. If I switch to calendar view, I have at the moment a daily calendar, but as we've seen earlier, I could change that to my work week calendar and so on. So let's look at some of the features that these views have in common, and let's try to learn how to do a little bit more with them. One of the most common features of views is a table view. Almost all elements of Outlook 2010 have a table view. For instance, if we go to the Contacts module, we have a list view, which is actually an example of a table view. And the features are common. There's a set of columns. Each column has a header. And as you can see here, the rows in the table are effectively categorized according to, in this case, company. Let's see how all that works in a bit more detail. So let's continue with the list view in Contacts. Each row in this view is one of my contacts, Mrs. Tina Androtti, Mr. Mike Brown, and so on. Each column is one attribute of that contact, one piece of information about a person. So in this column I have full names, in this column I have job titles, and so on. It's quite straightforward to customize this view, and let's start by adding a new column to the visible view. One easy way of doing that is to right click on the header of a column, say the job title column, and go to Field Chooser. And what this does is to display the list of the available pieces of information about each contact, and I can choose which of those pieces of information I would like to show in my list view. I'm going to show say their last name. In order to do that, I click on that and literally drag that to the header into the position I want. And that will then drop last name into my table. Notice how it's gone in a little bit too small. I can't see the whole of each field. It's easy to change the width of a column because literally I hover over either the right or the left edge of the header until I get that vertical bar with the two arrows, and then drag it to the size that I want. There we are. I've now added a last name column to my view. We saw earlier on how to move columns about. So for instance, if I wanted to put job title somewhere else, grab it and drag it. That's straightforward enough as well. And finally, if I want to actually delete one of the columns, I can just right click and click on remove this column. It's important to note that this doesn't actually delete any information about that person from my contacts. It just means the column is no longer visible in this list view. And one point not to remember is the list view has actually got a lot more columns than you can actually see. And if you use the slider at the bottom of the display here, you can scroll through all of the available columns in this particular list view. So, we've seen how to add columns to a view, move the columns around, and so on. Let's look at sorting the rows in the view. In this contact view, I have about a dozen contacts now, and they're actually in groups according to company name. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the order in which they're displayed is actually not very clear, but you can see from the headers which column the view is sorted on. And in fact, this is sorted on job title. The little arrow there tells you which column is being used. Now, the direction of the arrow tells you whether it's ascending or descending view. It doesn't really help very much in this case because we only have two job titles, and the sorting will be within these groups. So the entries under the Friendship Motors group will be sorted in order, but there is only one. Similarly, Leicester Motors, there is only one. So let's look at one of the other columns. Let's go for last name, but there isn't actually room to see an arrow, so let's just make it a little bit wider. And to sort on that column, all you need to do is to click on it, and the arrow goes away from the job title and onto the last name. And you can tell that pointing upwards means it's sorted into ascending alphabetical order as you look down the page. Androtti, Chalama, Doe, and so on. Click again to change direction, and now it's in descending order, although of course it is within these groups, within the company groups. It's very easy then to change the sort order, but in fact the sort order can be on more than one column. We're going to be able to use this later on in a more full list or table view, but I'll just briefly show you now how to do that. If I right click anywhere on the header and click in View Settings, one of the options available in the Advanced View Settings list dialog is Sort. If I click on that, it actually gives me access to a more complex dialog where I can choose to sort on more than one column. So I could, for instance, sort on last name descending, and then on, say, company ascending. So it will first of all sort on last name and then on company name. And I can add other fields to this sort sequence as well. Click on OK. It warns me that one of the fields I'm sorting on is not in the view. Do I want to show it? Yes, I do. Click on OK. And now, apart from seeing last name with the wedge to denote that it's sorting on that, if I go along here, I'll find company right near the end now. It's just been introduced. And we just stretch that along there, and you can see the wedge there as well. Clearly, if I wanted to move company to make it visible, I could just drag it as I did before. But now you can see how I can use more than one field when I'm sorting. So I've now got my contact list sorted on two fields, but it's still quite confusing at the moment because of the grouping, which I mentioned just now. Currently the contacts are grouped by company. I'm going to remove this grouping. It's quite easy to do. Click on any of the headings, right click, go into View Settings, look at the Group By option, and I'm going to just clear that. I don't want any grouping at all. Click on OK, click on OK, and my contacts are no longer grouped. Now, if I look at the way the contacts now appear and the sort order, you can see what's happened. The first company, given that they're sorted into ascending company order, is anybody without a company name. So that's the people where it's blank. And within that company, i.e. no company, the names are in alphabetical order, Androtti, Chalama, and so on. Then the companies are in alphabetical order, Friendship Motors, Leicester Motors, and so on. So I now have no grouping, but I have all of my contacts sorted by company name and then by last name. Let's just look at a couple of other useful features of groups before we move on to the next section. In order to sort easily, we saw that we could just click in the heading to do a sort on a single column. For grouping, we can group easily by merely dragging the heading into this top area. That automatically groups according to whatever the heading is. And another useful feature is if you look at the names in these three groups, if you're particularly interested in a particular company or a particular group, you can actually minimize any of the groups by pointing on the little arrow there. So if I was only interested in Friendship Motors, I could leave that open and close all of the others. Another useful little feature. Now in the next section we're going to spend a little bit more time looking at views and some of the other ways that we can take advantage of the many possibilities that Outlook 2010 offers us.